Ric Flair's been wrestling since 1972, I believe, somewhere around there. So he's basically been in the business for 45 years. His legacy is living on with his amazing daughter and the awesome work that she's doing currently in WWE, which is really nice to see Ric Flair still having an influence on the business to this day. My memories of him, too many to list for a top 10 video. But when you think back to where Ric Flair got his start in the early 70s, I think he broke in with Billy Robinson and Vern Gagne up in Minnesota, and he was kind of a pudgier guy, and, you know, it took him a while to kind of develop that nature boy Ric Flair character, and it wasn't until he came down to the South and started working for the NWA and the Carolinas where he really made himself famous and really made himself a star. He was the one guy in another territory that was on equal footing almost, I think, with somebody like Hulk Hogan in the WWF. He was on the cover of every magazine, winning countless awards, a bona fide world champion, and for a long time, you know, him and Hogan were sitting atop the wrestling world, and Ric Flair, I think, was more respected than Hulk because of how he could work in the ring. Ric Flair was a very fun wrestler to watch. Wasn't the most technically sound guy, I think, ever, but as far as his ability to work a long match, the amazing shape that he was in, some of the spots that he could do, and the ability to tell a story and really work well with certain opponents, nobody was better than Ric Flair. I think of the matches he had with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, with Harley Race, with Dusty Rhodes, Magnum TA, and Barry Windham, and Sting. Jesus, all the matches they had together, and the great legacy that he built for himself in the NWA and the NWA territory, and then finally coming into the WWE in the early 90s there when he finally had the dispute with the then WCW and Jim Herd during the buyout and the selling from Crockett and transferring of power over to Turner and all that shit. And Ric Flair got the hell out of there and went into the WWE. And upon arrival, within 4, 5, 6 months, something like that, he's the WWE champion, winning the 1992 Royal Rumble. Arguably my favorite Royal Rumble of all of them. For me personally, it's a tie between 1992 and 2001, but that 92 Rumble was unbelievable and such an awesome match with the awesome prize at the end. The WWE title was actually on the line in that Rumble, something that we had not seen up until that point. The title had been held up once or twice, but we had never seen a world title won in a Battle Royal or a Royal Rumble or anything like that, and Ric Flair was the first guy to do it. So the fact that he came in after being such a big name in the NWA and one of Vince McMahon's biggest competitors as far as, you know, the talent really helping NWA compete with WWE to begin with, Ric Flair was one of those guys. So the fact that Vince brought him in and put the world title on him right away was pretty cool. He had some great matches in WWE. That match at WrestleMania 8 with Randy Savage was pretty damn good, and that amazing performance he had in the Royal Rumble match itself, because I think he entered that match at number 3, so he was out there for over an hour. His title reign was pretty short-lived because he did drop it to Savage at WrestleMania 8, but eventually would win it back and then coughed it up to Brett just a few weeks later, and then he was out of the WWE. So he was only there about a year and a half, maybe even less, but what he accomplished in that time was pretty good. He did a lot in that year span, and it was a nice little feather in his cap, you know, as far as if he wants to be considered one of the greatest of all time, you have to be able to win belts everywhere. And for him to be on top of the NWA and WCW and then jump over to WWE and be on top there and then go back to WCW, which is what he did in 1993 after he lost the Loser Leaves Town match to Kurt Hennig on Raw the night after the Royal Rumble, 1993. He jumped back to WCW and was world champion within a matter of months. So his body of work is pretty damn impressive. My memories of Rick and the Four Horsemen are etched in my brain, especially some of the stuff they did in the mid and late 80s. That group that they formed with Tully and Arn and J.J. Dillon and Barry Windham and Lex Luger were in and out, and there was some rotating Horsemen members, but that core group there with J.J., Arn, Tully, and Flair was one of my, if not my favorite faction in all of professional wrestling history. It was so fun to watch those guys, and they weren't to be fucked with. At the time, they were heels that were actually cheered by the crowd. I even remember at WrestleMania 8, the same show that Savage and Flair match took place on, there was fans in the crowd holding up a big, like, bed sheet with the words Four Horsemen on it, which was awesome, especially to see something like that on one of Vince's TV shows. So Ric Flair's legacy in the Four Horsemen and how popular they got, that stretched worldwide. Everybody knew who the Four Horsemen was. They were all over the magazines and the NWA, and it was really hard to miss those guys. And not only did Ric Flair pave the way for a lot of singles wrestlers and a lot of future champions that would come after him, they also paved the way for factions. I mean, without the Four Horsemen, I don't know if we ever have an NWO or a DX. or any sort of dominant faction to that level. The Four Horsemen kind of invented all that stuff and took it to heights that allowed the future to have a lot of factions and dominant groups and shit like that. When you put a whole bunch of champions together, I loved that. I loved it when Tully was the TV champion and Ric Flair was the world champion. Tully and Arn would also be tag team champions together, and it was a pretty impressive stable because they always had great wrestlers in there. There were a few duds. I wasn't a fan of Luger being in the Horsemen. Definitely wasn't a fan of Paul Roma being in the Horsemen. And Sting being a part of the Four Horsemen always confused me, so there have been a few that haven't been so great, but Pillman was a Horseman. He was awesome. Benoit was a Horseman. Malenko was a Horseman. I miss those days, and I miss that group. As a matter of fact, they released a Four Horsemen DVD, didn't they? And I remember that documentary being really good. Everybody was interviewed for that thing. Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard and Barry Windham and all of them. And I remember really enjoying that DVD. I should pull that out and watch it again. I haven't seen it in a few years. But what I think made Ric Flair himself great is that he was so fucking versatile. He was charismatic as hell. His interviews are the stuff of legend. He was able to take a lot of pieces from past gimmicks and past wrestlers like Gorgeous George, Buddy Rogers, and Nick Bockwinkel, and a lot of those type of gimmicks that were, you know, the suit-wearing, well-spoken, Rolex watches, sunglasses, you know, kind of carrying the belt with pride and dignity and honor. He really looked and dressed like a world champion. That's why I was always such a big fan of guys like Flair and Bockwinkel, because I loved the way they carried themselves. They were the very definition of class, and Ric Flair could cut a promo better than anyone. And then when you put him in the ring and realize how good he is in the ring too, and how capable he is, and the great matches he had with all those guys I listed earlier, and the great moments and all the world title wins that he had. Not only as a heel, but also a babyface. I mean, Ric Flair had a pretty damn impressive career, and it's one that I'm never going to forget. I mean, I don't really even have a memory. I don't have a professional wrestling memory in which Ric Flair does not exist. I can't say that about Hogan. I remember watching wrestling before Hulkamania was even born. But Ric Flair is a guy that has been around during all of this stuff, and his longevity has spanned so many years, all the way up until most recently. I know I can give Ric Flair a hard time sometimes with some of the decisions he's made in his personal life that might personally annoy me, but it's never taken away for how much I respected his wrestling career. I really, really wish that 2008 with Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania would have been his last match. That would have been the cherry on top of what I thought was already a pretty awesome career. So I would think I will always be disappointed that Ric Flair went to TNA and got back in the ring after that great send-off. I mean, I don't recall too many times where I cried harder during a wrestling show than I did when Ric Flair retired from wrestling, because he's such an emotional guy. It was such a perfect time for him to step down. He went into the WWE Hall of Fame, had his retirement match with another guy that can have the argument for being the best in-ring worker of all time, and the match itself for Ric Flair at his age to put on a match that was that memorable. I thought the finish to that match and the drama and everything surrounding it and how hard Rick and Shawn worked in that match could not have gone better. It was a picture-perfect weekend for Ric Flair, perfect Hall of Fame, perfect retirement match, tons of emotion, and an absolutely beautiful send-off the next night on Monday Night Raw. And it was one of my favorite weekends in professional wrestling history. This is a guy on top of wrestling for 40 years that survived a plane crash. A plane crashed in the very city that I used to live in, Wilmington, North Carolina, back in the 70s, and the motherfucker not only survives, but goes on to wrestle for another 30 years. It's crazy. He's overcome a lot of adversity in his life, and he's had to suffer some tragedies as well. I think it's horrible what happened to his son, Reed. But Rick had an amazing career, and he came damn close to making himself household name material. I mean, when you think about people who don't watch professional wrestling, they've all heard the name Hulk Hogan, they've all most likely heard the name Randy Savage, and they've all probably heard the name Ric Flair as well. His signature woo and the Nature Boy and all of that. Even people who don't watch wrestling probably have seen Ric Flair before a time or two. And that's a very short list. You know, the guys like Hogan, Savage, Andre the Giant, Ric Flair, The Rock in present day because of how successful he became in movies and Hollywood and all of that. There's only a few guys that casual fans or people who aren't fans of wrestling at all have heard of before. And Ric Flair, I think, made it to those heights. So